We're live! Woohoo! On today's show, we have the amazing author Jane Steen. So, for anybody who doesn't know who you are, the 1% of the population who don't know who the amazing author Jane Steen is, who are you and what kind of books do you write?
I write historical mystery series. I have 2 series going. And yeah, who am I? I'm Jane Steen, as the name says on the screen.
Okay, well, shall we go on to the first book you picked?
Yeah.
For anybody who's not seen this show before, it's a fairly simple format. It's book, talk to the person why they pick the book, next book, and then at the end there's a special segment. So we'll do the books first. So your first book was Ice Blue by Emma Jameson.
Yes, it was. And I picked this book because this is a crime series, police procedural type. So it's the British police, and it's set in London. And I picked this one just because when I really want to relax, this is the kind of book I like to turn to. And this is the first in a series. I think there's about half a dozen books. And when I read it, I just wanted to read the other books. And I just ripped through all the books that she'd written about these characters. And what it is you have Tony Hetheridge, who's the man in charge of this department, and the department is about investigating crimes against sort of high society people. Obviously, it's kind of a made-up department, I think. And Tony Hetheridge is the right man to head it because he is an aristocrat. He's Lord Hetheridge. And he is, this almost cliche aristocrat. He's very cool. He's very sophisticated. He's about 60. So a bit older, silver fox kind of guy. And he gets a new, I think it's sergeant at that point, and she's Kate Wakefield, and she's half his age. She's totally from the other side of the tracks. She's from a very ordinary background, and she's very outgoing and extrovert, while he's this kind of really self-contained introvert. And yes, and they solve crimes, but it's the characters. It's all about the characters.
So would you say when you're picking these books, it's as much about the characters are your main focus, or how much is plot versus characters for you personally when you're looking for a good fiction book?
I think I like characters best, and I definitely write character-driven books. And
Yeah.
yes, it is getting into the relationships between the characters. And so this is the kind of series I like, the kind of crime series where you have interesting plots and so forth. You have things that they have to solve, but it's also driven by these great characters that you just want to meet. And you're so interested in their relationships with each other and with all that. There's a lot of secondary characters in these books too, and they're all pretty interesting as well. And that's what I love about them.
Okay, well, shall we go on to the next book then?
Sure.
Which is Gemma Bovery by Posy Simmonds.
I have this one. So this is a graphic novel. I do like a good graphic novel. And Posy Simmonds is a writer, an artist that I have loved since, like 40 years.
Yeah.
I think. And what I like about her is that she writes these graphic novels based on very sharp observations of people. So she does paint these characters that they just work as real people. So you can see, I don't know if you can see her style. And then she started off writing, doing comic strips, which is how I originally discovered her, I guess. And I started buying the books. And then she sort of moved more into almost like more of sketches, and they got longer. And now she really writes these graphic novels. And Gemma Bovery Gemma is the second wife of Charlie Bovery. And they live in London, and they just decide they're fed up with it all, so they move to France. And this was very much written in the time when the British were really just buying up properties in France and moving there in droves, you know. And it's kind of about that whole escape to France thing. And they moved to the French countryside. And at first it's all perfect. All the food is so wonderful.
Yeah.
Bread is wonderful, you know, that kind of thing. And of course, over time, you know, the winters are cold, the house smells of you know, the drain smell, and so forth, and things go wrong. And Gemma, one of the first people that Gemma meets is the local baker, whose name is Joubert, and he's a literary kind of studious kind of guy, and he immediately says, Madame Bovery. And he says, well, you know, your name has this great resonance because, you know, we have this famous novel called Madame Bovary, and he gets obsessed with her, and he thinks, you know, because the Madame Bovary of the novel, it has an adulterous affair, and then she eventually commits suicide, and he starts thinking this terrible fate is in store for her.
Okay.
And many interesting things. Yes.
Yeah. I thought you were mid-sentence there.
You've got to read this one. This is a great book.
Okay. Shall we move on to the next book?
Okay.
Which is The Salt Path by Raynor Winn.
Yes. And this is another great sort of, it's a very English book. And it's funny, I think a lot of my choices are very English, even though I lived in the States for 20 years. But it is about a couple who, it's a real life story. It's a memoir. And this couple, Raynor and Moth, end up losing their home through, they get involved in a court case, and things go badly for them at the last minute, and they end up losing everything they have. And they're sitting in the cupboard under the stairs to hide from the bailiffs who are knocking at their door. And they just decide, okay, we are going to walk the south coast, the southwest coast path, which is like 600 miles. And they go and they buy, you know, a tent and sleeping bags and so forth. And they set off on this journey, and they have nothing. They have practically no income. They're on what little benefits they've been able to get. And even then they find that they half of their benefits aren't being paid to them. So they're living on almost nothing. Literally almost nothing, and they are walking this coast path, and it's just this amazing story, because on top of everything else, they've lost their home and so forth. Her husband Moth has got a brain cancer or something like that. He's very ill. So it's really what happens of the months that they spend walking this path, and how they, you know, how they just learn about themselves while they're learning about, you know, the countryside and so forth, because they're living in the tent and they're wild camping, so they're not even camping in campsites. There's this one point where they actually get to be in a campsite, and she gets to use an actual shower, you know, and it's the first time for ages. They're washing in the sea and so forth, and doing their laundry in the sea, and this literally, you know, happened just a few years ago.
Oh, so how much do you think, because you lived, as I said, you lived in the US for a while, do you think that that has made you more nostalgic for British books and British things?
I think I read this one after I moved back to the UK, and I think it was because I read it because I live near the sea now, and I obviously like to walk, and it just the whole idea of just taking off on this huge journey to as a way of coping with these terrible problems intrigued me. So I don't think it was definitely not a nostalgia thing. I think when I was in the States, I would probably read more American books. But now I guess I was just sort of interested in the world around me and how people related to it.
Okay, well, shall we move on to the next book then, which is Oscar, A Life by Matthew Sturgis.
Which is a doorstop or chunkster.
It's clearly about Oscar Wilde, I would guess.
Oscar Wilde, yeah. And I love a biography of Victorian personages. personalities. And so nearly always the first book I read every year is one of these enormous biographies. And so Oscar Wilde was last year's beginning of the year read. And I love this biography. I have to say that my books are set in the Victorian era, and I'm fascinated by it. And I'm fascinated by the artists and the writers and, you know, the personalities of the time. And I thought this was just a great biography. I really enjoyed it. I made tons of, you know, underlining. What I love about it is now that I've spent so much time reading about the era, I know a lot of the characters. And so there are so many of these Victorian characters in there. And so, you know, I recognize people, I might have read their biography as well. So it's this fascinating sort of nexus of literary, artistic, political.
So it's like I thought did he span the start of the 20th century as well? Is my understanding wrong about that? Is he more Victorian?
No, I'm not sure if I think he might have survived into the 20th century, but his life was cut short, really.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you know, he was imprisoned for homosexual acts. I mean, basically, in the, you know, he was imprisoned really for not being discreet about it.
Yeah.
That was essentially what got him into trouble, and the fact that he just wanted to fight for his rights. And he ended up in prison doing hard labor. And when he came out, I mean, he'd lost everything. He'd lost his home, he'd lost his wife, he'd lost his children, he'd lost his reputation, everything. And he ended up going to live in France, where he died at a fairly young age. He basically set out to he just didn't stop. He just kept going, and he just didn't want to give up any of his bad habits and so forth.
Yeah.
And he basically kept going until he died. He just, you know, broke his health and everything. So it's a terribly tragic story. But it's the man who came from, you know, he was a minor poet.
Yeah.
And he basically talked himself into being this great society figure. If he had been alive today, he would have been like a YouTuber or something like that. And at one point, when he was first married, he and his wife were celebrities for absolutely no reason. You know, they were just people that they were known because they were known.
Yeah.
And he just kind of talked himself into this career as a celebrity.
Yeah, it's interesting how there's always been those kind of people in history, hasn't it? And they're always infinitely fascinating. So it sounds like a good biography. Okay, shall we move on to the next book?
Let's move on to the next one.
Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel.
Yes, who's just got a new book out, I think. I haven't read any of her other books, but I really need to. She's a very interesting literary writer. And this is a post-apocalyptic book, which has now been made into a TV series, which I haven't watched yet, but I'm going to have to watch it. I've read this book 3 times, so you can see how I really liked it. When I first read it, I was not too sure about what I thought about it. And then there was suddenly this point where everything came together. And it's a book about a pandemic.
Oh.
Which of the sort that successfully kills off, you know, like 99% of the world's population.
Yeah.
But it moves. You've got the pandemic at the beginning, and I have to say, as soon as the pandemic hit in March 2020, this was the book I read. Because I just kind of had to. And you move forward 20 years, though, and you've got some of the same characters, and you see what they're doing 20 years ahead. And it mostly centers around this young woman who was a child when the pandemic hit. And, you know, she survived, and she went through, she doesn't even remember half of what she went through in the intervening years, because it's pretty bad, you know. But she survived, and she ended up traveling with a sort of traveling company of actors, because she starts off as a child actor, and she ends up with this traveling company of actors who travel around the American Midwest in, you know, like horse-drawn cart, giving productions of Shakespeare.
Oh.
And the premise of the book is that survival is insufficient. So you need the art as well as just existing. And and it's all about that, really. It's about how people survive spiritually as well as like physical survival.
So do you think, like, related to the pandemic, big pandemic in the world, that this kind of amplified the importance of this book for you then?
I think it made it a book that I wanted to read when the pandemic hit, because of this idea, that it's not just about whether you survive physically. Because at the time in March 2020, I mean, we didn't know what was going to happen, did we? It could have really been the collapse of everything we knew and all that kind of thing. And the idea was that, that there was more to just surviving than simply physically surviving.
Yeah.
And there's just there's just some wonderful moments in this book. When there's this point where, like, she talks about, there's a museum of artifacts. Somebody has started a museum of artifacts in an airport, where a community has gathered, to live in this airport.
Yeah.
Because they all got, when the pandemic hit and everybody started dying, they were basically away from home. They were traveling and they ended up in this airport and they never left. And somebody has assembled all these artifacts from the world before. So by this time it's 20 years on. And there's all the reflections about, there's a snow globe and everything that it took to make this snow globe and bring it to this point in space. And so that, all the civilization that they had lost, the manufacturing and everything, and the people that designed it and the whole thing. And so, there's reflections on what civilization is. It's really hard to describe. It's not an easy book to read, but I just love it. It's like I've read it 3 times.
It's the worst case scenario from a pandemic, and it's probably quite interesting reading it during a pandemic, I guess.
Yeah, it was.
Okay, well, shall we move on to the next book, which is Doomsday book by Connie Willis.
Which is an oldish, I think 1980s, 1990s kind of science fiction book, which is also about a pandemic, sort of.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I was just obviously in a mood for reading pandemic books at that point, but I read this one when I was a young woman and I loved it then. And, quite often I found that when I've found these books that I read many years ago and I read them again, I don't like them, but I like this one just as much as I did. And this is, so this is it's 2050 and they've invented time travel and it's being used by the universities really for historical research. And Oxford University sends a young woman back into the past and she's supposed to be landing about 40 years before the Black Death. And she's going to research some things about the language and the way people lived and so forth. And something goes wrong and she ends up in the Black Death. And so, and of course, she can't find her way back. She can't get back to where she was so that she can get rescued. And in the meantime, in 2050, there is an epidemic. Which is unusual because in 2050 they've got all these really good antivirals, so people don't usually get sick. And the interesting thing about that, and so this book, remember, was written in the 80s or the 90s.
Yeah,
they developed these antivirals because early in the century, in the 2000s, there was a pandemic.
Yeah.
So 40 years before, she was actually predicting the pandemic. And one of the interesting things she says is that the deaths were high in America because there were so many people who wouldn't get vaccinated because they thought it was against their civil liberties.
Yeah. There is a lot of prediction in fiction, isn't there? So to speak.
Yeah, and it's a great story because you've got the medieval time and then you've got them coping with a modern day epidemic, and they have to, and then of course there's a sort of a race against time because the character who's going to save her is sick and so on.
Okay, well, shall we move on to the next book, which is by an amazing author, Lady Helena Investigates by Jane Steen.
Yeah, this is my second series, and it's a lady sleuth story. So it's set in the late Victorian era. It starts in 1881. And the tagline is, a reluctant lady sleuth finds she's investigating her own family. And it kind of follows the typical lady sleuth formula. The first murder she has to solve is her husband's, because she's just been widowed. And then a mysterious and handsome French physician comes and says to her, well, I don't think it was an accident, and so forth. So, of course, this goes on, and she has to solve a mystery, but it's also about her family. She has this large family, and she's the sixth daughter of an earl, and all her older sisters, they're all, so that all the other five sisters are all much older than she is. And there's big age gaps between them. And the premise of the whole series is that she's going to find out a lot more about her family than she had expected to.
Yeah.
There's all these things she doesn't know about her siblings. And this is the first book, and it's kind of the setting the scene book, the origin story.
So you would say this is more historical fiction than detective book, so to speak?
My mysteries tend to be lighter on the mystery and heavier on the family, on the drama, the sort of family drama. And this one came about because I had been binge watching Downton Abbey, and I had also just read the first in the Lady Julia Gray series by Deanna Raybourn. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice to kind of mash those two things together? And so this Lady Helena Investigates definitely is somewhat derivative of the Lady Julia Gray, that particular Lady Julia Gray book, but I didn't go on and read the rest of the series, so I've no idea where it departs, but it was just kind of my riff on it. I thought, this is really interesting because Lady Julia has this big family, and I thought, I really like the big family thing, and I like the family drama in Downton Abbey. So I put them together, and it sold pretty well. So I think other people like that sort of mashup as well.
Okay, well, shall we move on to the next book, which is by another esteemed author, Stephen King, Misery by Stephen King.
I was a Stephen King fan when I was young, and then I just completely went off him. I was actually reading The Stand, and I got about 3/4 of the way through, and I couldn't stand it any longer. So, but a few years back, I was staying someplace, and Misery was up on the bookshelf, and I started reading, and it's an absolutely brilliant book. Of course, if you've seen the movie, I love the movie as well. It's about an author who who's in a bad car accident, and he's rescued by his #1 fan, Annie Wilkes, and she intends to hang on to him. So it is a horror story, but it's also got an awful lot about writing, about being a writer, and that's it's part of what I love about it. I mean, I've read Stephen King's book on writing, and I think Misery actually tells you more about writing, about being a writer, than On Writing does. It's absolutely where she makes him write a new book in her Misery series. Misery is this heroine, and she makes him write this new book, and he writes this first chapters, and she says, no, that's completely wrong. You're cheating. And he writes them again, and you get to read the chapters, and you can see how he takes the book from good to great.
So it probably helps to actually read it rather than seeing it in the film, in a way, because you get to read the actual novel within the novel, so to speak.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, well, shall we move on to the next book? Which is The Devil in the White City by Erik Larson.
A non-fiction book, which is about the Chicago World's Exposition in 1893, at which there was a murderer called H.H. Holmes.
Oh.
And so it's non-fiction. It's about the fair, and it's about H.H. Holmes and the murders that he committed. And honestly, I'd recommend any book by Erik Larson. And also, if you ever get a chance to go and see him, he is a wonderful speaker. Very funny. Very, very good speaker.
So is the murder related to the Chicago welfare then, or is it just at the same
Well, that's
time?
where he got his victims. I mean, there were loads of people coming in from all over, so it was a really good place for a murderer to sort of move around. And he had this murder house with secret, openings and hideaways and so forth in it. He built this murder house, and he enticed women, and he murdered them.
Oh, okay. That sounds like a good TV series, doesn't it? It's like
it's pretty interesting. H.H. Holmes is a very interesting character, and there is a theory out that he might have been Jack the Ripper, because at one point he went to England, he went to London, and he was there at just the right dates. And at the date when he left, Jack the Ripper stopped.
Oh, okay. Well, that is interesting. Anyway, on that conspiracy theory, let's go on to the next book, which is Painting the Darkness by Robert Goddard.
Robert Goddard is a writer that I used to like as a young woman, and I just, kind of forgot about. I didn't read his books. And then I came to Painting the Darkness because I was interested in a particular historical character, a real historical character, and he turns up in this book, and it is just a great Victorian mystery. Goddard's books always have this kind of a darkness to them, which I really like, and he just tells a wonderful story. Great twists. So this is about this man appears, and he claims to be this married woman's long lost fiance. And of course the mystery is he or isn't he? And it's a very twisty tale. Sometimes he kind of skirts on the edge of darkness without ever getting graphic, but he's a wonderful storyteller.
So I've noticed a slight dark historical theme amongst some of these books.
I mean, that's reflected in the books that I write.
Yeah. Which brings us on to another book that you wrote, which is Lady Odelia's Secret by Jane Steen.
And I don't have a print copy to show you because it's not in the print version, isn't finalized yet. This is my latest book, and it's the second book in the Lady Helena series. Well, the series is called The Scott de Quincey Mysteries because Lady Helena's family surname is Scott de Quincey. And so Lady Odelia is Helena, the next sister up in age, but she's 10 years older than Helena. And when Helena was a child, she went to live in London. She's an artist. And so she invites Helena up to London because she suggests that Helena commission a series of paintings for her magnificent house in the country. And she introduces Helena to sort of her world of art. And then at one point she goes missing. And the story kind of goes from there. I'm not going to say anything.
Yeah, it's a difficult one to describe and not spoil a book, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, well, shall we move on to the next book then, which is Wilding, The Return of Nature to a British Farm by Isabella Tree.
This I listened to as an audiobook. Totally different kind of story. I mean, this is a non-fiction, and it is about an estate in West Sussex. I live in East Sussex. This is in West Sussex, an estate called Knepp. And this was an estate that had been, like many estates were in the Second World War, it was ploughed up to make farmland. And so, they have the current owners. and they'd been farming it, and the land was just getting poorer and poorer, and they were having to put more and more fertilizer in. And then they decided to return a bit nearer the house to nature, to just let it go and see what happened. And amazing things happened. And they ended up returning the whole estate to the wild. And they did it in a very business-like way. I mean, this was a serious thing. They'd studied how this had been done in Holland and so forth, and they decided to be pioneers in Britain of this particular venture of returning an entire piece of land to the wild. And eventually they brought in, like wild boar and wild horses and cattle and deer and all the rest of it. And they say it's very businesslike. You learn a lot about the farming business in this book. And now it is a very successful concern. And they, then they farm, but in a sense that they manage the land. They have to cull the animals sometimes because the numbers get too big. And they go into all that, why they have to do it. And so they do, glamping. So, sort of high-end camping. They do safaris, they do tours, they sell the meat from the animals that they cull, and they made it into a whole different kind of business.
So is this quite contemporary then? Is this like this century? Okay.
Yeah, this is a recent thing, and it's something that a lot of people have been talking about: is rewilding the land, letting nature back in, so that with saving the insects and therefore the birds and so forth. And the amazing thing is that in 10 years, nature, so much nature just came back. And we almost immediately, rare butterflies and things started appearing on the land. All sorts of animals just came back, just reappeared. And it was just like the land healed itself so fast. And of course, all the neighbors were furious, because they were letting farmland go to rot, as they thought, and there was huge opposition. But in the end, they just kept going, and they've made a successful business out of it.
So does the return to nature, is that what appeals to you about this book, or is it just particularly well written in terms of a book?
Actually, it's got quite a lot. I'm glad I listened to it as an audiobook, because it's got quite a lot of actual factual stuff about farming and so forth, soil pH and things like stuff that I wouldn't probably have not enjoyed reading in a book, printed book, but it was fine when you're listening to it. Somehow it just makes complicated things easier when you're listening to them.
Yeah,
I find. And so what intrigued me about it, I am intrigued by the idea of returning areas of the land to nature, and just rethinking the way that you manage the environment around you, which is happening a lot in this country. I mean, there's people to stopping mowing like the roadside verges, and we're doing No Mow May, and just about every garden magazine or TV program, talks about, not killing the insects, not using pesticides, not using too many artificial sort of aids to gardening, not having these perfectly mown lawns and perfectly weeded borders at the expense of the wildlife, the insects and so forth, so that the birds have food and so on, right up through the food chain, which of course ends in us.
Yeah. Okay, well, shall we move on to the next book, which is Crocodile on the Sandbank by Elizabeth Peters.
Yeah, if you talk to almost any writer of historical mystery series, they will reference this series. This is the Amelia Peabody series by Elizabeth Peters. It is, when did she start the series? Perhaps in the 70s, something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, she's passed away, so the series is complete. And it is these larger than life characters, and this Crocodile on the Sandbank is the first book. They're set in Egypt. It's about it's about a woman who goes to Egypt as people did, travels to Egypt with a companion, and they meet these brothers who are archaeologists, and there are mysteries, there are murders, in just about every book there is a murder. And so they're running around solving murders in the Egypt. Well, it begins in, I think, the 1890s and then carries on right through to the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922. So and it's just a great series. There's so much humor. There's a lot of running around Egypt and people shooting at them and bodies being found in odd places. It's a light-hearted mystery series in so many ways. But again, there are dark episodes, and it's a family drama as well. So you can see where I'm getting this. You start off with just these 4 characters. And of course, eventually you've got the children and then the grandchildren and so forth. And then all these other characters, including a whole host of Egyptian characters. And I reread the whole series starting in January 2020 when I went to Egypt for the very first time.
Oh. So you feel like this is almost like a pioneering book in the historical fiction realm then? Was that what you were saying? Or?
I think she really showed how you could write a mystery series with a great cast of characters that you just want to meet.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I'm always looking for as a reader, and it's what I'm trying to do as a writer. I want to write mystery series with characters that you would just love to invite to dinner.
Yeah. Okay, well, shall we go on to the next book, which is by somebody I've actually met, An Unchoreographed Life by Jane Davis.
Yes, and Jane Davis is an excellent indie writer, and this is probably my favorite Jane Davis book so far.
Oh.
And it is, a lot of it's from the point of view of a young child called Belinda, who's living with her mother in a flat in London, and her mother was a ballerina who gave up her career when she got pregnant with Belinda. And it's about what her mother has to do to survive and live in London and so forth. But it's also a lot of it seen from Belinda's point of view. And of course, she's only about 6 and she can't understand really what's going on. It's, how can I say? It was just one of those books where I just had to keep going back to it and, keep turning the pages. Shed a tear or two and just really enjoyed the story.
So again, was it the story was powerful enough to keep you, but it was the characters that you liked, or was it?
Yeah.
Both?
Well, the characters, I mean, Belinda is a great character in herself. Yeah. She's very intelligent, but she's very anxious. And of course, she's only a small child, so she can't control anything around her.
Yeah.
And so you're seeing everything through the filter of Belinda. And then, of course, you start getting her mother's story as well from her point of view. And then you start understanding a bit more. It's the characters again. But also I thought it was a great story. It has some wonderful twists. Yeah. I kept thinking the story was going one way and then it would go the other way. And I love that. If you do that to me in a book, you send me in one direction and then you suddenly throw me in another, I'm going to like the book.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of books try and do that. Some of them succeed and some don't. I think that's the
this one definitely succeeds. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, shall we go on to your last book, which is The Other Times of Caroline Tangent by Ivan D. Wainewright.
Yes. And this one I discovered at the London Book Fair because Ivan won the Selfies. He won the adult fiction section of the Selfies, which is a fairly recent indie award. And I just looked at it and I said to her, "Oh, this looks interesting." I said, "It's the kind of book I'd like to read." And he said, "Well, take it and read it."
Oh, okay.
And I read it, and there was a point at which, and I'm not going to say too much about it, but there was a point at which I couldn't stop reading. And it was one of these books I stayed up half the night to finish. And then I gave it to my husband, and he enjoyed reading it too. And it is about a couple, John and Caroline. And John is kind of an inventor. He's a smart guy. He's an inventor, and he invents a time machine.
Oh, okay.
Because their passion is music, rock music. They use the time machine to go back in time to classic concerts, classic rock concerts.
Yeah.
Well, as you do. I don't know if I'd use a time machine for that. I want to go back and I'd want to study historical eras and so forth. But their interest is rock music, so that's what they do. They go to these famous concerts. And again, this was another book that I thought was going one way, and then it went in a different direction, and that's when I couldn't stop reading. And a lot of the reviewers have said the same thing. You reach this point where the story just suddenly gets fascinating. It's very interesting before then, even though I'm not a music fan, so I'm not a rock fan or anything like that. But I could relate to their love of music. He made it believable. And sort of, I almost didn't notice the clues that he dropped in as to what was going to happen either. So I thought that was good.
I think that's something good about a book is or any kind of story, it could be a film, where when the twist happens, it's obvious it was signaled, but you never picked up on it. I think that's the best kind of twist.
Yeah, this is very much a kind of a moment. And yeah, definitely. And I really do not want to say too much about this book and a lot of the books I read, because when I read them, I mean, it's not just the characters. There has to be elements of good plot. It's not just pretty words and interesting characters and people talking. Definitely, I like books where something interesting happens.
Yeah.
But if it's just plot, like there are some a lot of mystery writers who are all about the plot, and that often falls into this very strict formula. And yes, it might be in many people's eyes, that's what a pure mystery should be about.
Yeah.
But in my eyes, it's not. I find that boring, just really boring. But give me good characters on top of that, and that I'm not going to be nearly as picky about the plot. Although if the plot's got holes in it, I will usually see them, and they will annoy me.
Yeah. Okay. So that's done all the books, but we still have one thing to talk about. Well, we have more than one thing to talk about, but we have one thing product related to talk about, which is for anybody who has watched this show before, which I'm not sure there's that many people, but they will know that I asked the guest what item they would pick from Amazon if money was no object. So if anybody wants to buy Jane this particular item, which I'm going to put up in a minute, if I can get the old screen share thingy to work, to share screen. And
very small item,
very small but expensive. So might be a slightly on the expensive side, but it is this Mont Blanc fountain pen. I'm kind of guessing if you had to buy yourself a fountain pen, you probably would buy a cheaper one than this, but money was no object. I can see. So why this one? Why especially this one?
Oh, I just think it's very attractive. I like the blue. I'm sort of drawn to that color, and I like the skeleton design. And it's just clever. I mean, there are so many beautiful fountain pens from Mont Blanc.
Yeah.
I think they do such interesting pens, and a lot of them aren't anything like this kind of price. I mean, they might be $1,000 or something like that. But this came about thinking, well, if I could buy anything money no object on Amazon, I would probably want to get myself a better fountain pen, because I use a fountain pen. I like writing with a fountain pen. And this led me on to this whole kind of browsing journey where I looked at all these amazing pens, and a lot of them that are on Amazon are not actually for sale because they've been for sale, and they kind of,
Oh,
yeah, it's kind of disappointing. You have to get down to the lower end, but even on the lower end, I mean, there are so many fountain pens that I sort of think, oh, I like that, and I like that, and I like that, and I just like all the little details. And maybe it's just something about the whole Victorian thing too. There's something wonderfully traditional about a fountain pen like this.
well, there seems to be only one left in stock. So if anybody wants to buy Jane that pen, um, they better
Quick.
hurry up and do it. Or if they want to buy themselves that pen, they better hurry up and do it.
It's got a bestseller ribbon too, so it's good.
Well, I mean, how many of these would they have sold? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Two ratings.
2 ratings.
You've got to wonder who buys a pen like that on Amazon.
Well, I mean, the thing is, like, I think with all of us, there's a level of money where we can splurge on it. And I suppose if somebody's an oligarch or something, or somebody with huge amounts of wealth, then maybe that's small change for them, and they can just invest in a very nice looking fountain pen with extra gold and the like.
Well, I can see by the way they're boxed that they're meant as prestige gifts.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what they're designed for. It's designed for people to give somebody they seriously want to get on the right side of a very prestigious gift. So if you really want to get on the right side of me, you're going to give me this $19,000.
Yeah, I think they might. I don't. You never know. I think you might be embarrassed if somebody got you that pen, but
I'd probably just die of shock, actually.
Yeah.
I can't imagine. I don't know anybody who would buy me that kind of fountain.
Well, maybe that's something you'll get from the show. You never know. So what is happening going forward with Jane Steen then? Have you got any books in the works? You've got this one just out that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I've been pretty busy with the launch and so forth, and I have been trying to just improve my game when it comes to being a publisher and so forth.
Yeah.
But I'm about to start writing the third in the Lady Helena series. So, that's coming up. And I'm just really looking forward to that, and it takes me a long time to write a book.
Yeah.
So, another year and a half, something like that. So, yeah, I need to sort of get into that, and I want to get into that phase where I can really start dreaming about the story. I have a lot of ideas for it, but I've got to put them together into a plot. And I would say that plotting is probably my weak point.
Okay.
I am much more, my books are much more character driven, because that's what interests me. It's the relationships and so forth.
Do you plan out your books at all, or do you write them as you go in Stephen King style?
Kind of yes to both. I have a vague outline.
Yeah.
In the ideal world, I've done a fair amount of thinking about the book first and pre-writing, and thinking what are the key scenes and how am I going to connect them up and so forth, and what about any new characters. I kind of have to think about them and get to know them, and so I'll do pre-writing and things like that, and any different locations. And of course it's historical, so there's a certain amount of research that goes on.
Yeah.
And then by that time I usually have an outline of where I think the book's going. Then I write the first draft, which is always the hard bit. And then by that time, by the end of the first draft, I know the story, I know the characters, I know any new characters fairly well. And then I rewrite. I am a fan of rewriting because I find that the story just gets better. And sometimes I'm literally rewriting what I've already written, like it was already just right in the first draft. But then there's always things that I look through and I think, well, that's weak there, and I don't like this bit, and I should change this and so forth. So I do a fair amount of rewriting, and various times I have teams of beta readers, and so they give their input too. And, you know, at the beginning, when they give their input, I always feel like, no, when I first read their comments. And then later on, I go back and read through all their comments. And I think, actually, they got a point. And so, yeah, so I will make some changes there because I have pretty good beta readers.
Yeah. Okay. Somebody asked a question about a previous show, and I'm going to ask you as the first person to be asked this question. But let's say that civilization was ending in a week for some reason, and you could only pick one of these books to read before the end of the world. Which book would you pick?
Station 11.
Yeah.
Almost certainly. I mean, the other ones are great, but that's the one that I would probably read because of survival is insufficient. Yeah. So whatever happens, you know, we need to hold on to this love of creation, this love of art. We're not just you know, units that have to survive by, you know, eating or, you know, eating and killing and traveling or what have you, all these things you have to do. There's more to us than that.
Yeah.
So I'd want to remind myself of this before the world ended.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say finish the book, but then, but yeah, you're probably right. You just want to read the book before, because there's not much point in finishing a book if nobody's going to see it. So.
Well, I mean, honestly, if I were given, if somebody said, you know, you've got 20 months to live or something like that, yeah, that's what I want to do is write one more book.
Yeah.
I think. But no, if it's just a week, I'm not going to get anything done in a week. So I'd read instead.
Yeah.
And go and, you know, hug all my family members and do all those normal human things. But yeah, I'd read.
Yeah. So on that dark tone, how can people find out more about Jane Steen and your books?
My website is www.janesteen.com.
Oh, okay.
Very simple. And so that will tell you a bit about my 2 series. And I have a free first-in series for my other series, which is called The House of Closed Doors. And so that's available as an ebook on all the different retailers.
Let's just say Amazon for this show. But yeah.
But it's on Amazon and everywhere else, though.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say that you know, people may read in different environments, as I do. I have a Kindle, but I also have other e-readers, other places where I read.
Yeah.
And so yeah, definitely available on Amazon. Be warned, you may want to read the other books, but I distribute widely, so you know, I'm kind of everywhere in libraries and things like that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's been great to have you on the show. And I'm going to try and work out how to end the show now. Finally, thanks for all the people who've been watching, and there have been people watching. They haven't said anything, they haven't commented, but they have been people watching. So presumably they've been entertained. And I'm now going to say goodbye to everybody. Woo-hoo.
Goodbye, and thank you for watching.
And